How far would you go to help your brother? Uncle Henry banned all technology from his house the day we moved in. I was 16 when the plane went down over the Atlantic with both our parents inside. Noah was only 13 and barely spoke for the first 3 months after the crash. Uncle Henry was Dad's older brother who lived alone in this massive house in the mountains, completely off the grid except for one landline he kept for emergencies. He'd been preparing for the collapse of civilization for 20 years, stockpiling food and ammunition while ranting about government surveillance and mind control through Wi-Fi signals. The social workers thought it was perfect that we had family willing to take us, never bothering to check if Uncle Henry was actually equipped to raise 2 traumatized teenagers. The technology ban was absolute and immediate. Uncle Henry went through our suitcases that first night, confiscating our phones, Noah's Nintendo Switch, my laptop, even the smartwatch Mom had given me for my birthday. He locked everything in a metal safe in his basement, saying we needed to detox from the digital poison that was rotting our generation's brains. He actually believed that cell towers were transmitting thoughts into people's heads, and that social media was a government program to catalog citizens for future imprisonment. The only electronics he allowed were an ancient radio that only got 3 stations, and that emergency landline that barely worked half the time. At first I thought Noah was handling it better than me because he'd always been the quiet one. He went to his new school without complaining, did his homework by candlelight when Uncle Henry decided electricity usage needed to be minimal, and ate the weird survivalist meals without comment. But after 6 months, I started noticing things that terrified me. Noah was wearing long sleeves in summer, spending hours locked in the bathroom, and I found him sitting on the roof at 3 in the morning just staring at the sky. When I tried to talk to him about Mom and Dad, he'd just say they were lucky they didn't have to live through what came after. I found the cuts on his arms when I walked in on him changing after he thought I'd left for school. They were deliberate, organized, parallel lines from his wrist to his elbow like he was keeping track of something. I begged him to talk to me, but he just pulled his sleeve down and said there was no point because nobody understood what was happening in his head anyway. He said the only people who ever got it were in his online support group from before, other kids who'd lost their parents and actually understood that sometimes breathing felt like betrayal. Those kids had kept him alive during those first horrible months, but now they probably thought he was dead too, since he'd just vanished without explanation. That's when I remembered the tablet Mom had bought me for school that I'd left in my locker the day of the crash. The school had mailed it to Uncle Henry's house, but I'd intercepted the package and hidden it in the barn under some old horse blankets from when Uncle Henry used to have animals. I spent a week figuring out how to piggyback off the neighbor's Wi-Fi from half a mile away, setting up a hidden spot in the loft where Noah could get signal. When I showed him the tablet and told him he could talk to his group again, he actually cried for the first time since the funeral. For 4 months, Noah snuck out to the barn every few nights while Uncle Henry slept. His whole demeanor changed completely once he reconnected with those kids who understood his grief. He stopped cutting, started eating regular meals, and even laughed at my dumb jokes sometimes. He told me his group had been worried sick about him, that they'd tried calling hospitals and police stations thinking something terrible had happened. One girl named Anita, whose parents died in a car accident, had apparently posted about him every day, begging for any information about where he'd gone. These weren't just random internet strangers, but kids who'd saved each other's lives by being the only ones who understood that kind of loss. Everything shattered on a Tuesday night when I woke up to Noah's empty bed and Uncle Henry standing in his doorway holding the tablet like it was a live grenade. He'd found Noah in the barn, talking to his support group about the anniversary of our parents' death coming up. Uncle Henry's face was purple with rage as he showed me screenshots he'd taken of Noah's conversations about wanting to die, about the cutting, about how Uncle Henry's house felt like a prison where he was slowly suffocating. "You gave him this poison," Uncle Henry said, his voice scarier in its quietness than if he'd been screaming. "You let him connect with strangers who were encouraging his sickness. These people were probably pedos grooming him, and you handed him right to them." Noah was sobbing behind him, begging Uncle Henry not to take away his only lifeline, but Uncle Henry just turned to him with cold eyes and said the words that made my blood freeze. "Pack your things because tomorrow morning you're going to Wilderness Warriors Reform Camp where they'll fix whatever these perverts did to your brain." I knew about that camp from the news where 3 kids had died from neglect and exposure, where they made you hike 20 miles a day and beat you for talking back. Noah looked at me with pure terror in his eyes, and I knew that sending him there would be signing his death warrant. Uncle Henry locked us in our rooms and said transport would arrive at dawn to take Noah away. I pushed against my bedroom door and felt the wood give slightly before hitting something hard on the other side. The scraping sound of metal against wood made my stomach drop as I realized what Uncle Henry had done. He'd installed slide bolts on the outside of our doors while we were at the school, probably planning this for weeks. I pushed harder, testing different spots on the door, but the bolt held firm. We were trapped like actual prisoners in what used to be our bedrooms. I pressed my ear against the wall between Noah's room and mine, then knocked 3 times, paused, and knocked twice more. It was our old code from when we were little kids hiding from Dad during hide-and-seek. After a few seconds, Noah knocked back with the same pattern but weaker, and even through the thick walls I could tell he was crying. The sound made my chest tight because Noah never cried anymore, not since the funeral. I sat on my bed and tried to think clearly, but kept remembering those news stories about Wilderness Warriors Reform Camp. One kid died from dehydration after they made him hike 15 miles without water as punishment for talking back. Another got an infected cut on his leg that they ignored until it was too late, and he died from blood poisoning. The third one, a boy Noah's age, fell off a cliff during a forced night march when the counselors wouldn't let him use a flashlight. My hands started shaking as I pictured Noah there, already so fragile, being screamed at by those counselors who thought breaking kids down was the same as building them up. He wouldn't last a week in that place, maybe not even 3 days. I dropped to the floor and found the heating vent near my baseboard, pressing my mouth close to the metal grate. "Noah," I whispered as loud as I dared. "Noah, can you hear me?" There was shuffling from his room, then his voice came through faint but clear enough. "I'm here." His voice was thick from crying. "Listen to me," I said, keeping my mouth right against the vent. "I'm not letting them take you. We're getting out before dawn, okay?" He didn't answer for a moment, then whispered back, "How?" He locked us in. I told him to hold on and trust me, that I'd figure something out. I stood up and scanned my room for anything useful, then spotted the wire hangers in my closet. I grabbed the sturdiest one and started bending it straight, remembering how I'd used this same trick to get my basketball off the garage roof last summer. The wire was thicker than I expected, and my fingers ached as I worked it into a long hook shape. I tested its strength against the door frame, making sure it wouldn't bend under pressure. Uncle Henry's footsteps suddenly creaked in the hallway, and I froze against the wall. His flashlight beam swept under my door, painting a yellow line across my floor. I held my breath, not moving a muscle as his heavy boots stopped right outside. He stood there for what felt like forever, before finally moving on toward his bedroom at the end of the hall. I waited until I heard his door close before sliding my makeshift hook under the door gap. The wire scraped against the floor as I worked it up the outside of the door frame, feeling blindly for where the bolt would be. My fingers cramped from the awkward angle, but I kept going, lifting the wire higher and higher. After 10 minutes that felt like hours, I felt the wire catch on something solid. I lifted gently, scared of making noise, and heard the soft click of metal sliding free. My door pushed open, and I had to stop myself from running straight to Noah's room. I crept down the hall, avoiding the squeaky floorboard near the bathroom, and repeated the process with Noah's door. My hands were steadier now, even though we were running out of time. When his bolt finally slid free and the door opened, Noah practically fell into my arms. His whole body was shaking, and I held him tight, feeling how small he still was at 14. "We have to call someone," he whispered into my shoulder. I nodded, and we tiptoed toward the kitchen where Uncle Henry kept the emergency landline. The old phone sat on the counter like always, but when I picked up the receiver, there was nothing. No dial tone at all. Either Uncle Henry had cut the line or last week's storm had knocked it out, but either way, we couldn't call for help. Noah's face went pale when I shook my head, and I grabbed his hand to keep him from panicking. Back in my room, I pulled the sheets off my bed and started tying them to the blanket using the knots Dad had taught us for camping. Noah kept watch at the door while I worked, his eyes wide with fear every time the house creaked. The knots had to be perfect because we were dropping 12 feet to the ground, and Noah already had enough bruises from Uncle Henry grabbing him. I tested each knot 3 times, pulling hard to make sure they'd hold our weight. The window opened quietly, and cold mountain air rushed in, making us both shiver. I pressed my ear against the door and heard Uncle Henry's footsteps going back to his room at the far end of the hall. We stayed frozen by the window for what felt like forever, Noah gripping my arm so tight it hurt while we listened to the house settling around us. The old floorboards above Uncle Henry's room creaked once, then twice, and finally we heard the familiar sound of his bed springs groaning as he got in. Noah kept shaking beside me, and I rubbed his back the way Mom used to when he had nightmares, counting the minutes on my watch until we could be sure Uncle Henry was really asleep. 10 minutes passed, then 15, and finally we heard that deep rumbling snore that meant he'd taken his sleeping pills like he did every night for his back pain. I tied the sheet rope around the radiator under the window and gave it 3 hard pulls to test if it would hold our weight. Noah went first because he was lighter, and I needed to be able to catch him if something went wrong. His hands were slick with sweat as he grabbed the sheets, and I had to help him get his legs over the windowsill. He looked down at the 12-foot drop, and I saw his whole body tense up, so I grabbed his shoulders and reminded him about the time we climbed down from our treehouse during that thunderstorm when Dad was at work. He nodded and started lowering himself down, the sheets creaking against the window frame with each movement. My arms burned, holding the rope steady while he climbed, watching his feet search for grip against the house siding. When he was halfway down, the sheet started to slip, and I had to wrap it around my waist to keep it from sliding through my hands. Noah dropped the last 3 feet and landed hard in Mom's old flower bed that Uncle Henry never bothered to maintain. He rolled to the side and looked up at me, giving a small thumbs up that he was okay. I swung my legs out and started down fast, my shoulders screaming from the strain as I went hand over hand down the sheets. The knot at the blanket started coming loose when I was 5 feet from the ground, and I just let go, landing next to Noah with a soft thud. We stayed crouched in the flower bed for a moment, watching Uncle Henry's dark window for any sign of movement. Nothing happened, so I grabbed Noah's hand and we started across the yard toward the barn where I'd hidden the tablet months ago. Uncle Henry had installed a motion sensor light after some raccoons got into his garbage, so we had to stay close to the tree line where the sensor couldn't pick us up. Noah grabbed my hand like he used to when he was little and scared of thunderstorms during camping trips. His palm was sweaty and cold, but I squeezed back hard to let him know I had him, that I wasn't going to let anything happen to him. We moved through the shadows cast by the big oak trees, our feet crunching softly on the dead leaves that covered the ground. The barn door was open just a crack like always since the latch had broken years ago, and Uncle Henry never fixed anything that didn't directly affect him. Inside, it smelled like old hay and motor oil from the broken tractor that had been sitting there since before we moved in. I used the flashlight app on the tablet for just a second to find my way to the corner where I'd hidden it under a pile of horse blankets that were thick with dust. The tablet was right where I'd left it, wrapped in a plastic bag to keep the moisture out. When I turned it on, the screen was so bright we both had to squint, and I saw it still had 22% battery, which would be enough for what we needed. The neighbor's Wi-Fi signal was weak, but it connected after a few tries. Their password still the same one I'd figured out months ago by watching them type it through binoculars. I opened Noah's support group website and handed him the tablet, watching his fingers shake as he typed in his username and password. The login took forever with the slow connection, but finally his group's chat page loaded up. Noah started typing fast, his fingers flying across the screen as he explained we were in immediate danger and needed someone to call 911 right now. He typed out Uncle Henry's full address and said the reform camp transport was coming at dawn to take him to a place where kids had died. The message sent, and we waited, both of us staring at the screen while precious seconds ticked by. Then Anita's username popped up with a response that she was calling police right now, and her mom was calling CPS, Emergency Services. More messages started flooding in from other kids in the group, telling Noah to stay strong and that help was coming, that they wouldn't let anything happen to him. I checked my watch and saw it was 2:47 a.m., which meant we had maybe 3 hours before the transport van would arrive to take Noah away. We couldn't stay in the barn because Uncle Henry might check here first when he realized we were gone, so we needed to get to the neighbor's house where we'd be safe. I shoved the tablet in my pocket and we crept out of the barn, heading for the woods that separated Uncle Henry's property from the Brooks family who lived half a mile away. The woods were thick with brambles and fallen branches that scratched our arms and caught on our clothes as we pushed through. Noah was breathing hard from anxiety, and I could hear him starting to wheeze the way he did when his asthma acted up. I kept him moving by talking quiet about Mom's Sunday pancakes and how we'd have them again someday when we were free from Uncle Henry and living on our own. We stumbled over roots and rocks in the darkness, using the tablet's dying light sparingly to avoid the worst of the obstacles. After what felt like hours but was probably 20 minutes, we saw the lights from the Brooks house through the trees. Their dog must have heard us because it started barking loud and aggressive, the sound echoing through the night air. The porch light blazed on suddenly, and we froze behind a thick tree trunk, terrified that Uncle Henry would hear all the noise and come looking for us with his hunting rifle. The front door opened, and a woman stepped out who I recognized as Raina Brooks from the times we'd seen her getting mail when Uncle Henry drove us to the school. She was wearing a bathrobe and holding a baseball bat, looking out into the darkness where we were hiding. I made the decision to step out where she could see us, pulling Noah with me into the circle of porch light. Raina gasped when she saw us standing there in our pajamas, covered in scratches from the woods and shaking from cold and fear. Her eyes went straight to Noah's arms, where his sleeves had gotten pushed up during our escape, showing the old scars that ran in parallel lines up his forearms. Without saying a word, she dropped the bat and rushed forward, putting her arm around Noah's shoulders and guiding us both inside her house. She locked the door behind us with the deadbolt and the chain, then grabbed a blanket from the couch and wrapped it around Noah, who was shaking, so bad his teeth were chattering. Raina picked up her phone and dialed 911, her voice calm but firm as she told them she had 2 minors at her house who had just escaped from an abusive situation. She gave them our names and Uncle Henry's address, making sure to emphasize the reform camp threat and asking for immediate police response because the children were in danger. She hung up the phone and pulled the curtains shut tight while telling us to stay away from the windows. Noah was still shaking under the blanket, and I could hear his breathing getting worse, that wheeze that meant his asthma was kicking in from all the stress. Raina grabbed an inhaler from her kitchen drawer and handed it to him, saying her son had asthma too before he went to college. Noah took 2 puffs, and his breathing started to calm down, while Raina peeked through a crack in the curtains. That's when we saw Uncle Henry's flashlight cutting through the darkness outside, moving fast across his property toward the tree line. His voice carried clear through the night air even from inside Raina's house, yelling our names over and over with threats mixed in about what happens to boys who run away from family. He was shouting about God's plan for order and how we were spitting in his face by disobeying our guardian. The flashlight beam swept back and forth through the trees and then started moving straight toward Raina's property. Uncle Henry must have figured out where we went since this was the only house for miles around. His boots crashed through the underbrush, and then we heard him hit the fence that marked the property line between the 2 houses. He started screaming at the top of his lungs about kidnapping and how Raina had no right to take his nephews from their home. Raina pulled out her phone and started recording video through the window while Uncle Henry rattled the fence and demanded she send us out immediately. He was saying she was harboring runaways, and that was a crime, that he'd have her arrested for interfering with family business. Raina kept recording everything while whispering to us that we were safe and the police would be here soon. Uncle Henry started climbing over the fence, and that's when we saw the red and blue lights coming up the road. A patrol car pulled right up between the 2 properties with its spotlight blazing across the yard. Deputy Bart Estes stepped out, and he was huge, maybe 6'4", moving slow and careful with his hand resting on his gun. Uncle Henry immediately turned toward him and started ranting about his rights as our legal guardian and how these were his boys who needed to come home. The deputy held up his hand and told Uncle Henry to calm down and step back from the fence. Uncle Henry kept shouting about how we'd been poisoned by the internet and needed discipline to save our souls. Deputy Estes walked over to Raina's door, and she let him in while keeping us back from the entrance. He asked to speak with us separately and took me into the kitchen first while Noah stayed with Raina in the living room. I pulled out my phone that I'd grabbed during our escape and showed him the pictures I'd taken months ago of Noah's arms when the cuts were fresh. The deputy's face got real serious as he scrolled through them and asked when these were taken. I told him about finding Noah on the roof that night staring at nothing, and how the only thing that helped was his online support group. Deputy Estes wrote everything down in his notebook and then went to talk to Noah alone. I could hear Noah's voice from the other room, quiet but steady, telling the deputy about wanting to die after our parents crashed and how those other kids online were the only ones who understood. He was explaining how Uncle Henry took away his only lifeline and threatened to send him to that camp where kids died. After about 20 minutes, Deputy Estes came back out and told Uncle Henry to wait by his patrol car. Then he walked across to Uncle Henry's house with his flashlight and disappeared inside for what felt like forever. When he came back, his face looked angry, and he was holding his phone with pictures on it. He showed Raina the photos he'd taken of the slide bolts on the outside of our bedroom doors, thick metal bolts that locked from the outside like we were prisoners. Deputy Estes got on his radio and called for a CPS emergency investigator to come immediately. Then he walked over to Uncle Henry and told him he wasn't allowed to leave the property until CPS arrived. Uncle Henry started yelling about government overreach, but the deputy just stood there with his arms crossed, not moving an inch. The sky was starting to get lighter when another car pulled up and a young guy got out carrying a briefcase. He introduced himself as Tariq Cummings from Child Protective Services and immediately started reviewing our statements with Deputy Estes. Noah showed him his phone with all the messages from his support group, including the ones about suicide prevention and how they'd talked him through the worst nights. Tariq took pictures of everything and wrote pages of notes while asking us questions about how long the doors had been locked at night and whether we'd had access to food and water. Right as the sun came up, we heard a van pulling into Uncle Henry's driveway, and my stomach dropped because I knew it was the reform camp transport. Deputy Estes walked over immediately with papers in his hand and met the driver before he could even get out. He told them the transport was canceled and the children were now in protective custody of the state. The driver looked confused, but took the paperwork and drove away without even turning off his engine. Uncle Henry completely lost it then, screaming about how we'd been corrupted by internet predators and the government was stealing children from good Christian homes. Tariq stayed calm and recorded everything on his phone while explaining that locking children in rooms and denying them mental health support was abuse, regardless of religious beliefs. That's when another car pulled up and Kylie Robbins got out, our school counselor who we'd both talked to a few times after our parents died. She was wearing pajama pants with a coat thrown over them and her hair was still messy from sleep. Raina had called her after calling 911 because she knew Kylie had been worried about us. Kylie confirmed to the investigators that Noah had been doing much better when he first started at the school, but then suddenly withdrew and stopped participating in grief counseling. She said she'd tried calling Uncle Henry multiple times to discuss Noah's needs, but he'd refused to let her visit or bring Noah to appointments. Tariq finished taking all the statements and photos, then explained that we'd need to go to the hospital for medical evaluation and documentation of any physical evidence. He said after that they'd work on emergency placement while the investigation continued. Deputy Estes offered to drive us himself to make sure we got there safe, and that Uncle Henry didn't try to follow us. The ride to the hospital took 20 minutes with Deputy Estes checking his mirrors constantly while Noah pressed his face against my shoulder in the back seat. The emergency room was bright and busy when we walked through the automatic doors, and a nurse took us straight to a private exam room after Deputy Estes explained why we were there. The doctor was a woman with gray hair who moved slow and careful as she asked Noah to remove his shirt, and when he did, she took pictures of every scar with a special camera while writing notes on a clipboard. Noah's arms had dozens of lines, some old and white, others still pink and raised, and the doctor measured each one with a ruler while asking when he'd made them. She asked him straight out if he wanted to hurt himself now that the tablet was gone, and Noah nodded without looking at her, his hands shaking as he admitted the thoughts had come back worse than before. The doctor wrote something on a form and explained they were making a safety plan right then, a list of things Noah would do when the bad thoughts came, people he could call and ways to stay safe until his next appointment. She had me come in next and told me to lift my shirt, and that's when she found the bruises on my shoulder. Purple and yellow marks shaped like fingers from when Uncle Henry had grabbed me last week after finding me sneaking food to Noah's room. The doctor took more pictures and measured these too, pressing gently to see if anything was broken while I tried not to wince. She said all this evidence would matter for what came next, that judges needed to see proof of what happened in our house. Deputy Estes drove us to the courthouse next, where we waited in a small room while Tariq filed paperwork with a clerk upstairs. A judge came down to meet us, an older man who read through all the reports and looked at the photos on Tariq's phone before signing papers that said Uncle Henry couldn't come near us or contact us at all. Deputy Estes took the papers and drove straight to Uncle Henry's house to serve them, and we could hear Uncle Henry yelling from inside Tariq's car about government overreach and kidnapping. Deputy Estes came back and told Uncle Henry that if he came within 500 feet of us or tried to call or write, he'd be arrested immediately. Tariq spent the next 3 hours on his phone calling every foster home and group home in the county, but nobody could take 2 teenage boys right away, especially not ones with our kind of problems. He kept shaking his head and making more calls, determined not to split us up after everything we'd been through together. That's when Raina spoke up from where she'd been sitting quietly in the corner, saying she could take us if the judge would allow it since she'd already passed a background check for her teaching job. Tariq's face lit up as he started making calls to verify her credentials, and within an hour, a judge approved her as our emergency placement while they figured out something more permanent. Deputy Estes went back to Uncle Henry's house with 2 other officers to get our clothes and personal stuff, coming back with everything shoved in black garbage bags that smelled like Uncle Henry's cigarettes. Raina drove us to her house, a small place with a garden out front and wind chimes on the porch that made soft sounds in the breeze. She showed us to a guest room with 2 twin beds and a window that looked out at trees instead of Uncle Henry's fence, telling us we could put up posters or paint the walls any color we wanted. The next morning, Noah had his first therapy appointment on Raina's laptop, talking to a woman who worked with kids who'd lost their parents. I sat outside the door on the floor, close enough to help if he needed me, but far enough that he had privacy. Through the door, I could hear him actually talking about Mom and Dad for the first time since the funeral, his voice breaking as he described the last time he saw them. The therapist's voice was calm and steady, asking questions that made Noah think about his feelings instead of pushing them down like Uncle Henry always told him to do. 3 days later, Raina found a letter in her mailbox with no stamp, just our names written on the front in Uncle Henry's angry handwriting. Inside was a page of Bible verses about sin and punishment, with a note at the bottom saying we'd burn in hell for betraying family. Raina took pictures of everything and called Deputy Estes right away, and he came to collect the letter as evidence. That afternoon, Deputy Estes arrested Uncle Henry at the grocery store, putting him in handcuffs in front of everyone, while Uncle Henry screamed about religious persecution. At the school the next week, Kylie called us both to her office and set up special plans for us, giving us extra time to finish assignments we'd missed and passes to leave class if things got too hard. She checked on us every day between classes, sometimes just a quick wave in the hallway, sometimes pulling us aside to make sure we were eating and sleeping okay. 2 weeks after that, the district attorney called Tariq to say they were pressing charges against Uncle Henry for child endangerment and false imprisonment based on all the evidence. Our court date was set for 3 weeks away, and Tariq came to Raina's house to help us write our victim impact statements, explaining how we could tell the judge exactly what living with Uncle Henry had done to us. The next morning, Noah opened his laptop at Raina's kitchen table and started typing a message to his support group about the upcoming court case. Within an hour, dozens of kids were responding with offers to write letters to the judge about how the group had saved them from suicide after losing their parents. Anita's mom, who worked as a social worker in another state, typed up a 3-page expert opinion about peer support being essential for grieving teenagers. By that afternoon, we had 47 letters printed out, each one describing how online support groups provided life-saving connections that adults couldn't replicate. Noah read each letter carefully, his eyes getting wet when a boy named Alan wrote about how Noah had talked him out of jumping off a bridge 6 months before Uncle Henry found the tablet. 3 weeks later, we sat in the courtroom while Uncle Henry's lawyer stood up and argued that he'd been protecting us from online predators by confiscating our devices. The judge cut him off after 2 minutes, saying that locking children in their rooms with slide bolts wasn't protection, but imprisonment. Uncle Henry tried to interrupt from his seat, shouting about government overreach, but his lawyer grabbed his arm and made him sit back down. The prosecutor showed the photos of Noah's scars and read excerpts from the support group letters, while Uncle Henry's face got redder and redder. When the judge announced the guilty verdict, Uncle Henry had to be restrained by the bailiff as he screamed about constitutional rights and religious freedom. The judge sentenced him to 2 years probation with mandatory counseling and parenting classes, plus he had to pay for our therapy and couldn't have unsupervised contact with any minors. Outside the courthouse, Tariq explained that Uncle Henry would probably never complete the requirements, which meant we'd never have to see him again. 2 months later, on my 17th birthday, Tariq helped me fill out the paperwork to become Noah's legal guardian when I turned 18. He showed me the requirements on his laptop, pointing to each item I'd need to prove: steady income, stable housing, and high school completion. I got a part-time job at the grocery store working evenings and weekends, saving every penny while Raina let us stay in her guest room. A local nonprofit that helped teen guardians called me after Kylie submitted our application, offering us a small studio apartment we could afford with my wages and the survivor benefits from our parents' insurance. We moved in with just 2 mattresses on the floor and a folding table Raina gave us, but Noah taped a sign on the door that said "Home" in green marker. I hung our parents' photo on the wall while Noah set up his desk in the corner with the tablet and started decorating with printed messages from his support group friends. We ate ramen noodles and frozen pizzas for weeks until I figured out how to use the ancient stove, burning 3 batches of spaghetti before getting one right. Noah started laughing at movies again, helping me badly cook dinner while telling me about the new kids in his group who needed support. Every Wednesday night at 8, he'd have his video chat with the group, and I could hear him giving advice to younger kids who just lost their parents. 4 months after moving in, a letter arrived with Uncle Henry's therapist's return address on the envelope. Inside was a single page where Uncle Henry wrote that he'd been wrong about the internet being evil, though he still believed the government was watching everyone. Noah read it 3 times before putting it in a drawer, saying maybe someday he'd write back, but not yet. 6 months later, on my 18th birthday, we walked into the courthouse for the guardianship hearing with Tariq beside us. The judge reviewed everything slowly, checking my pay stubs from work, our lease agreement, Noah's improved grades from the school, and the therapist's reports about his progress. I thought it would take hours, but after 20 minutes, the judge looked up and said everything seemed to be in order. That's when Noah stood up and asked if he could speak, his voice shaking but determined. He told the judge how I'd saved his life that night we escaped, how I'd been protecting him since we were little kids. He said he knew I was young to be a guardian, but I'd already been doing the job for years, just without the legal papers. The judge smiled and signed the petition, making it official that I was Noah's legal guardian, even though I'd just turned 18 that morning. We celebrated that night at Raina's house with a chocolate cake Tariq brought that said family in blue frosting. Kylie brought balloons, and Deputy Estes stopped by with a card signed by everyone at the station who'd helped us that first night. Noah connected his tablet to Raina's TV so Anita could join by video call, and she introduced me to all the kids from the support group who'd written letters. They cheered when Noah held up the guardianship papers, and Alan made everyone laugh by saying I was the coolest guardian ever for letting Noah stay in the group. Everyone stayed until midnight, eating cake and telling stories about their own families, both the ones they'd lost and the ones they'd found. The next morning, I took the guardianship papers from Tariq's briefcase and bought a simple black frame from the dollar store on my way home from work. Noah watched me hammer the nail into our apartment wall, right next to the photo of Mom and Dad we'd rescued from Uncle Henry's house months ago. He disappeared into his room and came back holding a drawing he'd made in art therapy. 2 stick figures standing side by side with their arms around each other, and he taped it underneath the framed papers without saying anything. 4 months had passed since we'd moved into our own place, and Noah hadn't cut himself once during that whole time, though some nights I'd find him sitting on his hands when the urges got bad. His therapist taught us both this thing called urge surfing, where you ride out the feeling like a wave instead of fighting it, and we'd sit together on the couch counting breaths until the worst passed. The apartment started looking less empty after we hit every thrift store in town, finding a scratched dining table for $20 and mismatched chairs that wobbled but worked fine. Noah claimed the corner by the window for his desk where he set up the tablet, now officially his to use whenever he wanted, and covered the wall above it with printed screenshots from his support group. Anita had sent him this whole collage of messages from the nights he'd been gone, all these kids posting about missing him and hoping he was okay. My graduation came faster than expected, and I walked across that stage in a borrowed cap and gown while Raina and Kylie screamed from the bleachers like crazy people. Noah stood up holding this poster board he'd decorated with glitter that said, "World's Best Guardian" in huge letters, and I completely lost it right there in front of everyone, tears and snot everywhere. The principal handed me my diploma while I was still crying, and I didn't care who saw because I'd actually made it through senior year while keeping us both alive. 3 months later, Noah started 9th grade at the local high school, walking through those doors with his head up instead of hunched over like before. His counselor called me after the first week to say Noah had signed up for the peer support program where kids who'd been through trauma helped other students. By October, he was co-leading a grief group for younger kids, using everything he'd learned from his online group to help 7th graders who'd lost parents or siblings. The anniversary of the plane crash came on a cold November morning, and we drove to the cemetery with grocery store flowers and letters we'd written the night before. Noah knelt by their headstones and read his letter out loud, telling them about his support group and how many kids he was helping now, how we had our own place and were taking care of each other like they would have wanted. For the first time since the crash, visiting their graves didn't feel like drowning in sadness, but more like checking in with people who were still part of our lives, just differently. Our apartment was tiny, and my restaurant job barely covered rent and groceries, but we had a routine that actually worked. Every night we'd sit at our wobbly table doing homework together, Noah working through algebra while I studied for my community college entrance exams. Wednesdays at 8, he'd video chat with his support group from his desk, and I could hear him laughing with Anita about school stuff between the serious talks. Saturdays we'd play video games on the used console Raina had given us, and Sundays we'd meal prep for the week, using YouTube cooking videos on the tablet. I turned the key in our apartment door one Wednesday evening after my shift, hanging both sets on the hook I'd installed by the entrance. Noah sat at his desk with the tablet propped up, explaining his history project to Anita while she showed him her research notes, both of them completely absorbed in normal teenage homework stress instead of survival mode. Standing there watching him smile at something Anita said, his sleeves rolled up without shame showing the faded scars, I realized we weren't just getting by anymore or waiting for the next disaster to hit. We were actually living a real life, messy and small but completely ours. 2 brothers who'd lost everything and somehow built something new from the pieces. Thanks for hanging out and exploring all those questions with me today. I really love just wondering about things together. Can't wait to share more curiosity with you soon. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.